32-year-old cisgendered woman with a past medical history of seizure disorder, learning disability, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, hypovolemic hyponatremia, UTI, status post-lap coli, complicated by cholecystoduodenal fistula, now admitted to NICU for septic shock and bacteremia. On my very first shift in the ED, I spent a lot of time with Laura. When I first met her, I wondered if she had a chronic disability of some sort. Many of the patients in resus may have trouble with communication or may appear altered in some way. But for most, this is a temporary state. For Laura, from her chart and from her mother who accompanied her to the hospital, I gathered that the quirks in her communication style were normal for her. Of course, in combination with the pain and uncertainty that all patients face in the hospital. I found myself drawn to Laura because of her disability. I have a personal and academic interest in disabled patients' experiences in the medical system. And I think a lot about how medicine has helped to define disability and make the world more ableist. In Laura's care, I felt hypervigilant in a way, observing how those around her communicated with her and treated her, and thinking even more closely about how I did as well. I identify with having a chronic illness, and with some discomfort and wondering whether I deserve the label, I also identify with being disabled. My understanding of disability casts a wide net, and I relate to this identity knowing that it encompasses an almost impossibly broad range of experiences. What ties it all together, though, is the experience of having a mind or a body that is chronically considered to be abnormal or lacking in some function. Hours into her stay, Laura could no longer receive pressors peripherally and required a central line. As the resident used an ultrasound to find a good spot in her neck, Laura and I talked. She needed to keep her head all the way to the left, so I went over there and asked her to look at me. Laura told me that her favorite fruit was oranges, her favorite television show MASH, and that Debbie was her best friend. She said that Debbie lived John, who had cancer but took care of Debbie. He helped her with medications, groceries, and even remembering doctor's appointments. Her other friend George lived with Annie, who took care of him like John took care of Debbie. She also told me that her mother called her all the time because she was sad that she was retired and all she had to do was go to the park. I told Laura, transitions can be hard sometimes. And she said, will you tell Mommy that, please? Once the resident found a suitable spot for the central line, he explained to Laura that in order to keep everything clean, we would need to put a blue sheet over her head during the procedure. He also said that to find a good angle for the line, she would need to turn her head all the way to the left and keep it there. Usually, when patients seem scared about something, I would ask them if they would want to hold my hand, and they may tentatively accept or decline in the name of independence. But Laura, she reached for my hand unprompted and squeezed. She tensed as the sheet went over her head and jerked her head towards the center. I joined her under the blue tent, smoothing her hair back, trying to gently direct her head towards the center. Her mother and I repeatedly called out, "Over here, Laura, look over here!" But understandably, every time the instruments moved in her neck, she would groan and turn her head towards the pain. After repeated attempts, enough that I felt like I was lying when I told her, "It'll all be over soon," the resident wasn't able to place the central line. After the sheet was removed, and everyone else had moved on to another patient, Laura's mom said she was tired and needed to go home to sleep, and came over to say goodbye to her daughter. As she left, I stayed and chatted with Laura a bit more and plugged in her phone. For much of the evening, Laura was concerned about 3 things: her phone, the red call button for the nurse, and the TV remote. She preferred that all 3 things be on her chest, where she could easily reach them at all times, and constantly asking about them. A little while after her mom left, I told Laura that I needed to go and see other patients too. She said, "No, don't leave me. I don't want to be alone." I told her that I had to go, but that I would come back later. I found myself frustrated that all I could find in the chart about Laura's diagnosis was the label, learning disability. On the one hand, I appreciated the open-endedness, that an overly self-assured provider hadn't determined her needs. However, I wish there had been someone trusted who I could ask more. Learning disability didn't contain what I craved, which was a story that told me what her needs were, how she liked to communicate, what her life had been like before, and how her needs were the same or different from other patients. But as I spent time with Laura, she made it very clear what her needs were. My naivete showed she didn't need her needs to be defined in some chart. Laura was definitely better than most patients at telling you what you wanted and letting you know when you were doing something she didn't like. What is the right way to get to know your patients and to understand what they need to feel heard, to understand what they're going through, and to feel safe? When is it the right time to ask explicitly? What is the role of close observation and emotional intuiting? I'm wary that it's easy to assume a patient's needs when they're easily legible to us in the chart. We may figure that a neurotypical patient's needs are not dissimilar from our own or other patients we've seen. But of course, people do so much work to cover up their needs, and I'm wondering how we can get to them with a little more intention. I'm scared. I'm scared that I'll be too tired, too angry, too selfish to dedicate the time necessary towards this goal. I fear I've seen it time and time again in other doctors. But I want a world of medicine where there's time and care enough for both me and my patients to make their needs known. We can't abandon the image of that medicine. Update. Laura's had a bit of a rough time in the NICU, but they found out that the reason for her current troubles is E. coli. Her mother, Julie, said that she held down food for the first time yesterday. She also said that her great-granddaughters had called and demanded to know where she was. I asked Julie if her daughter had ever had a more specific diagnosis, and she said, No, just learning disability. That's all they ever told me. But she's very functional, though, and lives in a home with people just like her. They take her shopping, and she sees friends. Her mother also told me that she's not been talking much today, barely responding to her. As I walk over to Laura to say hi, her mother says, Don't be offended if she doesn't respond to you. It's just how she is today. When I walk over, Laura closes her eyes and doesn't say anything when I say hello. But she raises her hand and gives a small wave.